When my billionaire husband kicked me and our 14-year-old daughter out on Christmas Eve for his 26-year-old mistress, he made one fatal mistake. He threw us out in front of 100 guests, humiliated us on camera, and thought he'd destroyed me forever. What he didn't know, I used to be a corporate lawyer, and I knew where every single body was buried. Before we get into this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't believe how this ends. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. And if you love a good revenge story, smash that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word of what happened next. Let me take you back to that night. When my husband kicked me and our 14-year-old daughter out on Christmas Eve for his mistress, he made one fatal mistake. He forgot I knew where all the bodies were buried. And honey, I was about to dig them all up. Let me take you back to that night, December 24th, 2 years ago. I'm Claire Montgomery, and I thought I had it all. An $8 million penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a husband who ran a hedge fund worth $280 million, a daughter who played piano like an angel, and another baby on the way. 7 months pregnant with my son, glowing in a Valentino gown that cost more than most people's cars. Our annual Christmas Eve party was in full swing. 100 guests filled our penthouse, business partners, family, Madison's friends from her private school, crystal champagne flutes, a 12-foot Christmas tree dripping with ornaments that cost $500 each, and a string quartet playing in the corner. I circulated through the crowd, playing the perfect hostess. 15 years of practice had made me good at it. I'd given up my career as a corporate lawyer when Madison was born. Garrett said he wanted his wife at home, that a real mother doesn't abandon her children for a career. And I'd believed him. I'd trusted him completely. Madison performed that night. My beautiful girl, 14 years old with her father's dark hair and my green eyes, sat at the grand piano and played Chopin. Her fingers moved across the keys with such grace that several guests cried. I stood watching her, one hand on my pregnant belly, thinking this was the happiest moment of my life. Garrett stood beside me, 42 years old, movie star handsome in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He'd been distant lately. Stressed about work, he said. I'd caught him on his phone constantly, stepping away for hushed conversations. But I'd pushed my suspicions down. I trusted him. 15 years of marriage. We'd built this life together. When Madison finished playing, the room erupted in applause. She stood and curtsied, beaming. That's when Garrett stepped forward. He clinked his champagne glass with a knife. The sharp sound cut through the applause. Everyone fell silent. I have an announcement, he said. His voice was steady, cold. I smiled up at him, assuming he was about to toast Madison's performance or announce some business success. Claire, Madison, I need you to leave. Tonight. The words didn't make sense at first. I kept smiling, waiting for the punchline. Amber will be moving in. She's carrying my child, and I've decided to start my life over with her. The room went silent. 100 people stopped breathing at once. I felt my legs go weak. Madison made a sound like a wounded animal. Daddy, what are you saying? That's when she walked out. Amber Sinclair, Garrett's 26-year-old executive assistant. She wore a red dress so tight it looked painted on. Her hand rested on a barely visible baby bump. She smiled at me, actually smiled, like she'd just won a prize. Garrett, this is a joke, I whispered. My voice sounded far away. I'm pregnant with your son. Get a paternity test, he said. That baby probably isn't even mine. 100 people gasped. Phones came out. People started filming. I could see it in their faces. Pity, shock. Some looked away, embarrassed for me. Others couldn't stop staring. You can't do this, I said. My hands were shaking. We've been married 15 years. We have a daughter. I'm 7 months pregnant. Security will help you pack one suitcase each. Garrett said, he wouldn't even look at me. I want you out in 30 minutes. Madison was sobbing. Daddy, please. It's Christmas Eve. Where will we go? For just a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe? But then Amber wrapped herself around his arm, pressing her body against his, and whatever humanity remained in him died. Figure it out, he said. His mother, Victoria, sat on the white leather sofa holding a champagne flute. 78 years old, dripping in diamonds, cold as ice. She'd never liked me, said I wasn't good enough for her son, but she'd always doted on Madison. I looked at her, silently begging for help. She took a sip of champagne and looked away. Two security guards appeared, men I'd known for years, men I'd given Christmas bonuses to. They wouldn't meet my eyes as they escorted Madison and me upstairs. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm sorry," one of them whispered. "We're just doing our jobs." I packed in a daze. One suitcase, 15 years of my life reduced to one suitcase. Madison stood in her doorway, still wearing her black concert dress, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I don't understand. Why is Daddy doing this?" I didn't have an answer. We walked back downstairs. The party was still going. People pretended to look away, but I felt every eye on us. Garrett stood with Amber, his arm around her waist. She was laughing at something someone said. The elevator doors opened. The security guard ushered us inside. As the doors closed, I saw Garrett raise his champagne glass in a toast. Outside, it was snowing, 20 degrees, and neither of us had proper coats. We'd left them inside. One suitcase between us and nowhere to go. Madison's teeth started chattering immediately. "Mom, what do we do?" I pulled out my phone. Dead. He'd cut the service. I tried my credit cards at the ATM across the street. All declined. I checked my bank account. Zero balance. Garrett had cleaned out everything. He'd planned this, meticulously. And I'd been too trusting, too stupid to see it coming. "We'll find somewhere warm," I told Madison. "It's going to be okay." But I didn't know if that was true. We walked 12 blocks in the snow. Every step hurt. My feet were swollen from pregnancy, stuffed into designer heels that were meant for posing, not surviving. Madison held my arm, shivering in her thin concert dress. People passed us on the street, hurrying to their warm homes, their families, their Christmas Eves that weren't falling apart. I tried calling my sister Emma, straight to voicemail. She was probably on a plane to Aspen with her family. I tried my former law school friends. No one answered. It was Christmas Eve. Everyone was celebrating. Around midnight, we found a 24-hour diner. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the soft glow of our penthouse. A tired-looking waitress with a name tag that read Carol brought us coffee without being asked. "Rough night," she asked gently. I couldn't speak. If I opened my mouth, I would start screaming. Madison stared at her untouched hot chocolate. She hadn't said a word in an hour. She just sat there, trembling, her mascara running down her face. Carol brought us soup and sandwiches. "On the house," she said. "Merry Christmas." I started crying. This stranger, this waitress working the graveyard shift on Christmas Eve, showed me more kindness in that moment than my husband of 15 years or his wealthy family had shown me in my entire marriage. We sat in that diner until 3 in the morning. Carol let us stay. Bless her. She even gave me $40 from her tip jar. "There's a women's shelter on Halsted Street," she said. "My aunt runs it. Tell her Carol sent you." The shelter was in a converted church building. When we arrived just before 4 in the morning, a woman in her 60s answered the door. Helen Winters had silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. Come in," she said, not asking questions. "Let's get you both warm." She gave us a small room with 2 twin beds, clean sheets, and a space heater that rattled but worked. It wasn't our penthouse with its heated floors and lake views, but it was shelter. It was safety. I lay awake that first night, listening to Madison's breathing and feeling my baby kick inside me. 24 hours ago, and I'd been planning Christmas morning. Now I was homeless, penniless, and my husband was sleeping with another woman in our bed. The next morning, pain woke me, sharp, stabbing pain in my abdomen. I stumbled to the bathroom, bleeding. Madison's scream brought Helen running. The ambulance ride was a blur. Emergency room doctors, monitors beeping. Madison's hand in mine. "We need to stop the labor," a doctor said. Dr. Robert Matthews, young and serious. "You're only 30 weeks. The baby's not ready." They managed to stop the contractions. "Bed rest," they said. "No stress." I almost laughed. No stress. My life had just imploded, and they wanted no stress. A social worker visited my hospital room. Her name was Anna Campbell, and she had kind eyes but official forms. Mrs. Montgomery, I need to ask you some questions. Do you have a safe place to stay? A shelter? I said. Family support. I thought about Victoria, sipping champagne while her son destroyed us. No. Financial resources. My husband froze all our accounts. She nodded, writing notes. I'm going to help you apply for emergency assistance, and I've contacted a legal aid attorney, Blake Hartford. He's one of the best. Blake Hartford. The name hit me like cold water. Blake and I had been in the same class at law school. He'd gone on to become one of Chicago's most ruthless divorce attorneys. I'd heard his name whispered at country club lunches. The man who destroyed husbands, who left wealthy men penniless. He visited me in the hospital that afternoon, still handsome at 45, with silver temples and expensive suits. Claire Montgomery, he said, shaking his head. I heard what happened. The whole city's talking about it. Someone posted video online. It's gone viral. My humiliation was entertainment now. Perfect. Can you help me? I asked. Let me review your case. He came back 2 hours later. His face was pale. Claire, I need you to think very carefully. 5 years ago, did you sign any documents at your mother's funeral? My mother's funeral. The worst day of my life. I'd been in such a fog of grief. Garrett had been so supportive, handling everything. He'd brought me papers to sign. Estate documents, I whispered. That's what Garrett said they were. Blake pulled out a legal document. This is a posted nuptial agreement. It says if Garrett divorces you for any reason after 10 years of marriage, you get nothing. Zero. You signed away all rights to marital property. Alimony. Everything. The hospital room tilted. That's not possible. It's legal. You signed it. It's notarized. But I was grieving. I didn't know what I was signing. Emotional duress is hard to prove. And even if we could, there's another problem. You're only entitled to child support for Madison. $2,000 a month. The baby you're carrying, Garrett's claiming it's not his. Unless you can prove paternity. You get nothing for this child either. I looked down at my pregnant belly. My son. Garrett's son. But Garrett was denying him. He planned this, I said. All of it. Yes, Blake said. He planned it very, very carefully. I was released from the hospital 3 days after Christmas. Madison and I returned to the shelter. Helen Winters had kept our small room ready. Other women were there, each with her own story of men who'd broken promises, violated trust, destroyed lives. Madison barely spoke. She'd lost 10 pounds. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. At night, I heard her crying through the thin wall. The day after New Year's, Blake called. Claire, I have bad news. Garrett's filing for custody of Madison. My blood went cold. He can't. He kicked us out. He abandoned her. He's claiming you're unstable and homeless. He's provided psychiatric evaluations. I never saw a psychiatrist. They're fake, obviously, but Claire, proving they are fake takes time and money. In the meantime, there's a custody hearing next week, and he has advantages. A stable home, financial resources, family support. You're in a shelter with no income. I'm her mother, and I've raised her for 14 years while he worked 80-hour weeks. I know, but family court is complicated. We need to prepare. The hearing was January 8th. I walked into the courtroom wearing the same dress I'd worn to the shelter. I had no other clothes. Judge Patricia Winters presided. A woman in her 60s with sharp eyes. Garrett looked impeccable. New suit, fresh haircut. Victoria sat behind him, along with his business partners, all showing support. Amber sat in the back row, her hand on her stomach, smirking at me. Garrett's lawyer, Richard Sullivan, was brutal. He painted me as mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, homeless. He presented the fake psychiatric evaluation claiming I was suicidal and a danger to Madison. Mrs. Montgomery has no home, no support system, Sullivan said. She's living in a shelter while pregnant. This is no environment for a 14-year-old girl. Blake fought back. He presented character witnesses. Helen Winters testified about my dedication as a mother. Carol from the diner testified about finding us that night. how I'd protected Madison. But it wasn't enough. Judge Winters announced her decision. Given Mrs. Montgomery's current circumstances, I'm awarding temporary custody to Mr. Montgomery. Mrs. Montgomery will have supervised visitation, 2 hours per week. Madison screamed. No, Mom. Bailiffs held her back as Garrett's people escorted her out. She reached for me, crying, but they pulled her away. I tried to follow. A bailiff stopped me. Mom. Madison's scream echoed down the hallway. I collapsed. Blake caught me before I hit the floor. That night, back at the shelter, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo. Madison sitting in our penthouse living room, Amber's arms around her shoulders. The caption read, "She calls me Mom now." I stared at that photo for hours. My daughter, my baby, in another woman's arms. Helen Winters found me at 2 in the morning on the shelter's fire escape. I was standing at the railing, 8 months pregnant, looking down at the street 4 stories below. Claire, she said quietly, step back. I have nothing left, I whispered. He took everything. My home, my daughter, my dignity. He's going to take my son too. What's the point? Helen took my hand. The point is that 14-year-old girl who was just dragged away from you, she needs her mother. She needs you to fight. I don't know how to fight anymore. Then I'll teach you. She pulled me back from the edge, literally and figuratively. 2 weeks later, my phone rang. Madison's number. I answered, hands shaking. Mom? No. Her voice was barely a whisper. Baby, are you okay? No, Mom, you need to know something. Amber's not pregnant. She's faking it. I heard Dad screaming at her last night. She's been stuffing her dress. Hope flickered. Are you sure? Yes. And Mom, there's something else. Dad's business. I heard him on the phone. He's stealing money. Lots of it. He has files in his safe at home. The code is my birthday. 0417. My lawyer brain kicked in. If Garrett was committing fraud, everything changed. The prenup could be voided. I could get everything. Madison, that's dangerous information. You need to be careful. I know, but Mom, I want you to have it. I want you to destroy him. After we hung up, I called Blake. If we can prove financial fraud, the prenup is void, he said. But we'd need solid evidence. Bank records, transaction files, something concrete. I can get it. How? I still have a key to the pen. Oh, Garrett forgot to change the locks. Blake was silent. Claire, that's breaking and entering. It's my home. I lived there for 15 years. Not anymore. Legally, you'd be trespassing. I don't care. This is my only shot. Blake sighed. If you do this, I can't know about it. Understand how? I understand. The next night, I put my plan in motion. Madison texted me that Garrett would be at a business dinner until 11. Amber was going to a spa with friends. I had a 3-hour window. I took the train to my old neighborhood, stood across the street from my penthouse, watching the windows. Dark. Empty. I used my old key. The lock clicked open. My hands were shaking as I stepped inside. Everything looked the same but felt different. Amber's cheap perfume in the air. Her things scattered around. Photos of her and Garrett on the mantel where pictures of Madison used to be. I went straight to Garrett's study. The safe was behind a painting, just like always. I entered Madison's birthday, 0417. It opened. Inside were hundreds of documents, bank statements, offshore account information, transaction records. I photographed everything with my phone, page after page of evidence. Garrett had been embezzling from his own fund, moving money to offshore accounts, defrauding investors, $200 million in fraud. This was it. This would destroy him, void the prenup, get me custody, get me everything. I was so focused I didn't hear the door open. Hello, Claire. I spun around. Garrett stood in the doorway, arms crossed, smiling. You really thought I wouldn't know you were coming. My heart stopped. Garrett stepped into the study, and I realized 3 things at once. Madison's phone was bugged. He'd heard every word. He'd wanted me to break in. This was a trap. Garrett, I can explain. Can you explain breaking into my home? attempting to steal confidential documents. He pulled out his phone. I've already called the police. They'll be here in 5 minutes. This is my home too. We're still married. Not for long. And legally, once I asked you to leave, you became a trespasser. He walked to the safe, looked at the scattered documents. Corporate espionage, theft, violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That's 10 years in federal prison. Claire, you're embezzling all this evidence. He laughed. That evidence, I planted it. Those are fake documents. The real crime here is you broke into my home and attempted to steal privileged information. I have you on camera. He pointed to a small camera I hadn't noticed. Every second of your breaking and entering. The room spun. You set me up. I set a trap. You walked into it. Just like you walked into signing that postnuptial. Just like you walked into trusting me. Claire, you were always too naive. Too trusting. It made destroying you remarkably easy. Sirens sounded in the distance. Why? I whispered. Why are you doing this? Because I can. Because women like you think marriage means something, think love means something, but it's just a contract, Claire. And I wrote better terms than you did. The police arrived. 2 officers, one named Officer Davis, the other Officer Brennan. They listened to Garrett's story, looked at the camera footage, looked at me, 8 months pregnant, clearly guilty. Mrs. Montgomery, you need to come with us. They arrested me in my own home, or what used to be my home, handcuffed me while Garrett watched, still smiling that cold smile. Oh, and Claire, he called as they led me away. I'm filing to terminate your parental rights. To both children, you'll never see Madison or that baby again. I spent the night in jail. The cell was cold and smelled like urine and despair. Other women were there, some drunk, some high. All of us society's disposables. At 3 in the morning, the contractions started. Early labor. Too early. The baby wasn't due for another month. Help, I screamed. Someone help me. They took me to the prison hospital. Shackled to the bed, I gave birth to my son, Owen, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, perfectly healthy despite everything. They let me hold him for 10 minutes. 10 minutes to memorize his face, his tiny hands, his dark hair. Then a woman from Child Protective Services took him. Where are you taking him? Into state custody? Pending investigation of your case. No, please, he's my son. But they took him anyway. Took him while I was still bleeding, still shackled to a hospital bed. I was arraigned 3 days later. The judge set bail at $500,000. I had exactly $0. The public defender assigned to my case, a tired woman named Margaret Foster, was blunt. Mrs. Montgomery, you don't have a defense. They have you on camera. You admit you broke in. The best thing you can do is take a plea deal. But Garrett set me up. He wanted me to break in. Irrelevant. You still committed the crime. Take the deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor trespassing. You'll get probation. Maybe 6 months. And my children, she wouldn't meet my eyes. That's a separate matter. Back in jail. I hit bottom. Postpartum. No baby. No daughter. Facing years in prison. The other women left me alone. Even criminals have standards. A woman who loses her children is the lowest of the low. I thought about Victoria, sipping champagne, about Amber, probably holding Owen now, playing mommy to my son, about Madison, being poisoned against me, about Garrett, who'd orchestrated all of this with surgical precision. He'd won, completely, totally won. That's when Rebecca Walsh showed up, a woman in her 30s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. She introduced herself through the jail's visiting window. Mrs. Montgomery, I'm an investigative journalist. I've been tracking your husband for 3 years, and I know what he did, all of it. Everyone knows what he did. It was filmed and posted online. No, I mean what he's really done. You're not his first victim. Claire, you're his 5th. Rebecca Walsh spread photos across the visiting room table. 4 women stared up at me from those photographs. All of them looked like they'd been beautiful once, confident, successful. Now they looked hollow. broken, like someone had reached inside them and scooped out everything that made them human. Meet Garrett's previous wives, Rebecca said quietly. She pointed to the first photo. Wife number 1, Sarah Bennett. She was a marketing executive when Garrett met her, 23 years old, full of ambition. He was 25, just starting out in finance. They fell in love fast, got married within 6 months. I stared at Sarah's photo. She had kind eyes, or she used to. In the photo, those eyes were empty. Garrett convinced her to quit her job after they married, Rebecca continued. Said he wanted to take care of her, that a wife shouldn't have to work. Sound familiar? My throat tightened. Those were the exact words he'd used with me. 10 years later, almost to the day, he served her with divorce papers, used the same postnuptial agreement trick. She got nothing. No house, no money, no alimony. She's working 3 jobs now just to afford a studio apartment. She's 41 years old and starting over from zero. Rebecca moved to the second photo. Wife number 2, Catherine Pierce. This one hits close to home for you. She was a corporate lawyer at a top firm in New York. Brilliant woman. Harvard Law, on track to make partner. The woman in the photo wore a power suit. She looked formidable, strong. Garrett pursued her relentlessly. Flowers every day, love letters, grand romantic gestures. She fell hard. When they got engaged, he asked her to move to Chicago for his career. Said it was temporary, that she could transfer to a Chicago firm. But she didn't, I whispered. No. He convinced her that partnership track was too stressful, that they should start a family, that she could always go back to law later. She quit, had his child, and 10 years later, he divorced her. Same pattern. Posted nuptial agreement she'd signed without reading carefully. She got nothing except child support. Where is she now? Working as a paralegal, making $40,000 a year. She lost her house, her savings, everything. Her daughter barely speaks to her. Garrett got custody, just like he got custody of Madison. He's very good at manipulating family court. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a system, a pattern. Garrett was a serial destroyer of women. Rebecca's voice dropped lower. Wife number 3, Elizabeth Warren. This is where it gets really dark. Claire, Elizabeth was a school teacher, sweet, gentle woman. She loved kids, loved teaching. Garrett married her when she was 26. Same pattern. Convinced her to quit teaching. Said he made enough money for both of them. She had 2 children with him. Rebecca pulled out a newspaper clipping. The headline read, Local woman found dead in motel room. 10 years into the marriage, Garrett divorced her, took everything, got custody of both kids. Elizabeth couldn't handle it. She tried to fight, but Garrett had better lawyers, more money, more power. She was working as a waitress, living in a motel, seeing her children 2 hours a week, just like you. My stomach twisted. She hung herself, Rebecca said quietly. In that motel room, she was 28 years old. She left a note saying she couldn't live with the shame, that everyone looked at her like she was a nothing, that her own children had started calling another woman mom. Sound familiar? Tears streamed down my face. That could have been me on that fire escape, looking down at the street, if Helen hadn't found me. There's a 4th, I managed to ask. Rebecca nodded grimly. Rachel Montgomery. Yes, same last name. She was Garrett's second cousin. He married her anyway. The family didn't object. Old money families care more about keeping wealth in the bloodline than about ethics. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and sad eyes. Rachel was different from the others. She came from money herself. Her family had a trust fund. Garrett couldn't touch that, so he got creative. What did he do? He divorced her after 9 years and 11 months, 1 month before she would have qualified for alimony under their prenup. He timed it perfectly. She got nothing from the marriage, and because of how he structured everything, she couldn't access her trust fund during the divorce proceedings. He tied her up in court for 2 years, bled her dry with legal fees. Where is she now? Barely surviving, living with her parents at 38 years old. Too traumatized to date, too broken to work. She has panic attacks if a man even looks at her. I stared at the four photos, four women, four lives destroyed, and I was number five. Why? I whispered. Why would someone do this? What does he get out of it? Rebecca leaned forward. I've spent 3 years trying to answer that question. I've consulted with psychologists, profilers, experts in narcissistic personality disorder. The best answer I can give you: control, power. Garrett gets off on breaking strong women. He doesn't want a partner. He wants a victim, someone he can mold, control, and ultimately destroy. But he loses too. He loses his family, his children. Does he, though? Garrett doesn't see his children as people. They're possessions, trophies, proof of his virility and success. He doesn't actually care about them. He just doesn't want you to have them. The visiting room suddenly felt too small, too hot. I couldn't breathe. Claire, listen to me, Rebecca said urgently. You're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're victim number four in a decades-long pattern of abuse. And you're the first one who has a real chance to stop him. How? I'm in jail. I'm about to lose both my children. I have no money, no power, nothing. You have something the others didn't. You have me. You have 3 years of investigation. You have evidence of the pattern. And you have something else. What? You have his mother. I stared at her. Victoria. She watched him throw us out. She did nothing. She's also been watching him do this 4 times before she hired me. Claire, 3 years ago, after Elizabeth's suicide, Victoria came to my office, gave me a check for $50,000 and said, "Find out what my son really is." She knew, but she suspected. After the first wife, she thought maybe it was a bad marriage. After the second, she started wondering. After the third, killed herself. Victoria couldn't pretend anymore. She knew her son was a monster, but she didn't know how to stop him. So she hired a journalist. She hired someone who could expose the truth without destroying her family name, someone who could build a case quietly, someone who could wait for the right moment. Rebecca paused. You're the right moment, Claire. You're the one who can end this. Why me? What makes me different from the others? Because you're a lawyer. You understand evidence, strategy, legal systems. Because you have a 14-year-old daughter who's old enough to testify and brave enough to help. Because unlike the others, you didn't break completely. You stood on that fire escape, but you didn't jump. I wanted to, but you didn't. That's what matters. Rebecca pulled out a business card. This is Victoria's private number. She wants to meet with you. She wants to help. She's willing to post your bail, $500,000 in cash. No questions asked. Why would she help me destroy her own son? Rebecca's eyes were hard. Because even monsters have mothers, and sometimes mothers have to choose between protecting their child and protecting his victims. Victoria's choosing you, all of you, the 5 wives, the children, the women he'll destroy in the future if someone doesn't stop him. I took the business card. My hands were still shaking. If I do this, I said slowly, if I help you take him down, what happens to me? I'm still facing criminal charges. I still broke into his home. If we expose the pattern, if we prove Garrett set you up as part of a decades-long scheme to destroy women, those charges go away. You become a victim, not a criminal. You get your children back. You get your life back. And if we fail, Rebecca didn't sugarcoat it, then you go to prison for 10 years. You lose both children permanently. Garrett selects victim number 6, and the pattern continues. I looked at the 4 photos again. Sarah, Catherine, Elizabeth, Rachel. 4 women who'd trusted the wrong man. 4 women who'd lost everything. Elizabeth was dead. The other 3 were barely alive. I thought about Madison, probably crying herself to sleep in that penthouse. About Owen, being raised by strangers. About Garrett, already planning his next move, his next victim. What do I have to do? I asked. Rebecca smiled for the first time. First, you get out of jail. Victoria will post bail tomorrow. Then we wire you up, and you make Garrett confess everything. On tape, in his own words. He'll never confess to me. He will if he thinks he's won. If he thinks you're completely broken and defeated. Men like Garrett can't resist gloating. They need you to know how smart they are, how thoroughly they destroyed you. This is insane. Yes, Rebecca agreed, but it's your only shot. Otherwise, you're going to prison. You're losing your children. And Garrett wins. Again. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Let's destroy him. Victoria Montgomery visited me the next day, 78 years old. Diamonds and designer clothes even in a jail visiting room. The woman who'd sat silent while her son destroyed me. Why, I asked, and why would you help me? Victoria's face was stone, because I've watched my son do this 4 times before. I told myself it wasn't my business, that marriage problems were between husbands and wives. But Elizabeth's suicide haunted me. That poor girl, 28 years old. She killed herself because my son broke her. You could have stopped him. I should have. After Elizabeth died, I hired Rebecca, told her to investigate, to build a case, because I knew Garrett wouldn't stop. He'd find another woman, and another, and he did. He found you. You watched him throw us out on Christmas Eve. I did, and I've regretted it every day since. I won't make that mistake again. Rebecca has a plan. If you're willing to help, we can destroy Garrett, legally, permanently. But it requires you to face him one more time. Help us, Rebecca spoke up. We need Garrett to confess everything on tape. We need him to admit to the pattern, the fraud, all of it. He'll never confess to me. He will if he thinks he's won, if he thinks you're completely broken and defeated. Men like Garrett can't resist gloating. Victoria nodded. I'll post your bail, $500,000. You'll be released. Rebecca will wire you up. You'll go to Garrett, beg for forgiveness, beg to see your children. And when he thinks he's completely crushed you, he'll tell you everything. This is insane. It's your only shot, Rebecca said. Otherwise, you're going to prison for years. You'll lose both children permanently. Garrett will win again. I thought about Madison, about Owen, being raised by strangers, about Garrett, already selecting his next victim. What do I have to do? 3 days later, I walked out of jail. Victoria had paid my bail in Washington. No records, no trails. Rebecca fitted me with a wire, tiny and invisible under my clothes. He'll probably pat you down, Rebecca said. But this is state of the art. Looks like a bra clasp. Even if he finds it, he'll have to look very carefully. The plan was simple. Garrett's annual Valentine's Day party was that night. Same penthouse, same guests. I would show up uninvited, broken and begging. And Garrett, believing he'd won completely, would confess everything. What if he doesn't? I asked. Then we have nothing, Rebecca said. And you're going to prison. I stood outside the penthouse at 8 that evening. Through the windows, I could see the party. Same glittering guests. Same champagne. Amber in a white dress now, playing hostess. I took a breath and went inside. The party noise died when I walked in. 100 people stopped talking at once. I looked terrible and I knew it. I'd lost 30 pounds. My hair was unwashed. I wore the same dress from the shelter, wrinkled and stained. Garrett stood by the fireplace. He saw me and smiled. That same cold smile. Claire, how did you make bail? I need to talk to you, please. This is a private party. Please, Garrett, I'll do anything. Just let me see my children. I'll sign anything. I'll admit I was wrong. Just please, I watched his face, saw the satisfaction bloom. He'd broken me, completely, and he was going to savor it. Everyone, please excuse us. My wife and I need to talk. He led me to his study, the same study where he'd trapped me. The wire under my dress felt hot against my skin. Garrett closed the door, poured himself scotch. You look terrible, Claire. I've been in jail because of you, because of your choices. I gave you a perfect life, and you threw it away by being paranoid and crazy. I was never crazy. You set me up. He sipped his scotch. Did I, though? Or did you just break into my home and steal my property? You wanted me to break in. You planted fake evidence. Prove it. Garrett, please. I just want to see my children. Madison, Owen, I'll do anything. Anything. He leaned against his desk. Here's the thing. Claire, Troy, you really thought you could beat me. You thought being smart or being right mattered. But power is all that matters. Money is all that matters. And I have both. Why did you do this? Why marry me at all? Why does anyone do anything because I could? Because breaking strong women is entertaining. You were wife number 5, Claire. Did you know that 5 women I've married and destroyed? My heart pounded. He was confessing, actually confessing. 5, I whispered. Sarah, Catherine, Elizabeth, Rachel, you. Each one thought she was special. Each one thought I loved her. Each one signed the prenup without reading it. Each one trusted me. He laughed. Elizabeth was the most fun. She actually killed herself. Saved me the divorce attorney fees. You're sick. I'm smart. There's a difference. The prenup, the custody case, the FBI trap, I planned it all, years in advance, because that's what intelligent people do. We plan, we execute, we win. And Madison Owen, they're your children. Madison served her purpose. She kept you compliant for 14 years. Owen, I don't care about Owen. Amber's not actually pregnant. That was just another part of the plan. Use a fake pregnancy to humiliate you more. He stepped closer. You're going to prison. Claire, 10 years minimum. Your children will forget you. Madison already calls Amber Mom. Owen won't even remember you exist. And when you get out, you'll be old and broken and alone. That's your future because you thought you could fight me. Actually, Garrett, I said quietly, there is something you forgot. What's that? I pulled my phone from my pocket. On the screen, the recording app was running. 30 minutes of audio. His entire confession. His face went white. You're recording this. I'm wearing a wire. FBI quality. And every word you just said is being broadcast to Rebecca Walsh and a room full of federal agents outside. The door burst open. FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the study. Rebecca walked in behind them, smiling. Garrett Montgomery, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. They handcuffed him, the same handcuffs he'd watched them put on me. This isn't over, he hissed. Actually, I said, it is. They arrested Garrett in front of his 100 guests, just like he'd humiliated me. Now he was dragged out in handcuffs while people filmed on their phones. Poetic justice. But they didn't just arrest Garrett. They arrested Amber too. Turns out she'd been complicit in all of it. She'd helped him destroy 4 previous wives. She'd faked pregnancies, testified falsely in court, forged documents. She was as guilty as he was. The FBI seized everything, the penthouse, the cars, the offshore accounts, $280 million in assets, all frozen. Victoria stood in the center of the penthouse, watching federal agents box up evidence. She looked older suddenly, tired. I should have stopped him after the first wife, she said quietly. I knew what he was. I just didn't want to admit it. Why help me now? Because Madison is my granddaughter. Because Owen is my grandson. Because I'm 78 years old and I'm done protecting monsters. Even when they're my son. Blake appeared at my side. Claire, we need to talk. The prenup void. Garrett obtained it through fraud. You're entitled to half of everything. That's $140 million. I couldn't process it. What about my children? Emergency custody hearing tomorrow. Given Garrett's arrest and Amber's involvement, you'll get full custody. Guaranteed. That night, I slept in a hotel, a real bed for the first time in 6 weeks. But I couldn't sleep. Tomorrow was the custody hearing. Tomorrow, I'd find out if I got my children back. The courtroom was packed. Judge Patricia Winters presided again. But this time, everything was different. Garrett sat in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed. Amber beside him, also in custody. Blake stood with me, confident and prepared. Your Honor, Blake said, given Mr. Montgomery's arrest on federal charges and the revelation that his custody petition was based on fraudulent evidence, we're asking for immediate return of both children to Mrs. Montgomery. Garrett's new lawyer, a public defender who looked overwhelmed, tried to argue, but Judge Winters cut him off. I've reviewed the FBI's evidence. Mr. Montgomery, you deceived this court. You presented false psychiatric evaluations. You manipulated custody proceedings. And based on Mrs. Montgomery's recording, you've done this to multiple women. She paused. Full custody of Madison Montgomery and Owen Montgomery is awarded to Claire Montgomery, effective immediately. Mr. Montgomery's parental rights are suspended pending criminal trial. The bailiff brought Madison into the courtroom. My daughter, thinner than before, but alive, whole. She saw me and ran. Mom, I caught her, held her. We both sobbed. I felt her ribs through her shirt. She'd lost so much weight. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I believed him. I thought you'd abandoned us. Never. I will never abandon you. They brought Owen next. My son, 6 weeks old now. A foster family had been caring for him. He was healthy, thank God. I took him in my arms, felt his weight, breathed in his baby smell. Mom, you have a baby, Madison said, staring at Owen. We have a baby. This is your brother, Owen. She touched his tiny hand. He grabbed her finger, and she smiled for the first time in weeks. That afternoon, I stood in the lobby of our old building. The doorman, who'd known me for 15 years, looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Montgomery, I'm not sure. The FBI released the penthouse this morning. It's mine now, legally mine. He checked his computer, nodded. Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery. The elevator ride-up was surreal. Madison held my hand, Owen in my arms. We walked into the penthouse. It looked ransacked. FBI evidence collection. But it was home. Can I have my room back? Madison asked quietly. It was always your room, baby. She went upstairs. I heard her door close. Then music. Piano music. She was playing again. I sat on the couch, holding Owen, and let myself cry. Not sad tears. Not angry tears. Relief tears. We'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, we'd made it through. Rebecca called that evening. Claire, my story drops tomorrow. Front page. Billionaire's serial wife destruction scheme. All 4 previous wives are testifying. The FBI has enough evidence to put Garrett away for 25 years. 25 years. Wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, plus civil suits from these investors he defrauded. He'll die in prison. Claire. Good. I meant it. The next morning, Rebecca's story broke. It was everywhere. National news. The photos of Garrett being arrested. Interviews with the 4 previous wives. Elizabeth's suicide note. The offshore accounts. The fake documents. Public opinion turned instantly. Garrett Montgomery wasn't a wronged husband anymore. He was a monster. A predator who'd destroyed 5 women for sport. My phone rang constantly. Interview requests, book deals, movie offers. I ignored them all. I had more important things to do, like feeding my son, like helping my daughter heal, like rebuilding our lives. Garrett's trial began in June, 6 months after that terrible Christmas Eve. 6 months of preparation, of gathering evidence, of building an airtight case against a man who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was an imposing building of gray stone and tall columns. I'd walked past it 1,000 times during my lawyer days, never imagining I'd be the victim in a case this big. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Reporters aligned the back wall, cameras ready. This wasn't just a trial. This was a spectacle. The billionaire who'd destroyed 5 wives, the Christmas Eve video that had gone viral, the recording of his confession. Everyone wanted to witness his downfall. All 4 previous wives attended. Sarah Bennett sat in the 3rd row, wearing a simple blue dress she'd probably borrowed. She'd lost everything, and it showed. Catherine Pierce sat beside her, back straight, lawyer's posture even though she wasn't practicing anymore. Rachel Montgomery was there with her parents, looking fragile and haunted, and Elizabeth Warren's sister attended, holding a photo of Elizabeth, making sure the jury saw the face of the woman Garrett had driven to suicide. Victoria sat in the front row on my side of the courtroom, the mother who'd finally chosen justice over blood. She'd aged 10 years and 6 months. The weight of enabling her son's crimes had broken something in her. Madison attended every single day of the trial, 16 years old now, sitting beside me in court-appropriate dresses, taking notes. Her therapist had asked if I was sure this was healthy. Watching your father be prosecuted, hearing the details of his crimes. She needs to see it, I'd told the therapist. She needs to see that monsters face consequences, that the system can work, that women can fight back and win. The prosecutor was a woman named Margaret Foster, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for destroying white-collar criminals. She'd taken this case personally after reading Rebecca's article. Mrs. Montgomery, she'd told me during trial prep, I've been a prosecutor for 20 years. I've seen a lot of bad men, but your husband, he's something special. He's a predator who weaponized marriage itself, and I'm going to make sure he never hurts another woman again. The trial opened with Margaret's statement to the jury. 12 people, 8 women and 4 men, all of them looking at Garrett with varying degrees of disgust. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Margaret began, this is not a case about a marriage gone wrong. This is not a case about a messy divorce. This is a case about a serial predator who spent 20 years perfecting a system to destroy women. She clicked a remote. Photos of all 5 wives appeared on a screen. Young, beautiful, confident. Before Garrett Montgomery, another click, the same 5 women, years later. Hollow-eyed, broken, defeated. After Garrett Montgomery, one of these women is dead, Margaret continued. Elizabeth Warren hung herself in a motel room because this man systematically destroyed her life, took her children, and left her with nothing. The other 4 barely survived, and the defendant, he was planning to do it again, and again, until someone stopped him. Garrett sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking calm and unbothered. His attorney, a public defender named Thomas Fletcher, who looked overwhelmed, kept shuffling papers nervously. Garrett had money for the best lawyers in the country, but they'd all refused to take his case. The evidence was too damning, the optics too bad. No one wanted their name attached to defending a serial wife destroyer. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Margaret presented bank records showing $200 million in fraudulent transfers over 15 years. Garrett had been embezzling from his own investment fund, stealing from the wealthy clients who trusted him with their retirement savings. She presented emails between Garrett and Amber Sinclair, his accomplice and mistress, planning how to destroy me specifically. The emails were chilling in their detail. Phase 1 complete, Garrett had written. Got her to sign the post-it-up at her mother's funeral. She was too grief-stricken to read it carefully. Phase 2, isolate her from friends and former colleagues. Make her financially dependent. Phase 3, pregnancy. Make sure she's 7 months along before executing the exit. Maximum vulnerability. Amber's response. You're terrible, I love it. When do I get to move into the penthouse? After the Christmas Eve reveal, I want maximum humiliation, maximum audience. The jury looked sick reading those emails. One woman was actually crying. Margaret called witnesses. The private investigator Garrett had hired to create fake psychiatric evaluations of me. The man testified reluctantly, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. Mr. Montgomery paid me $50,000 to create medical records showing his wife was mentally unstable, suicidal, and a danger to their daughter. He said, none of it was true. I fabricated everything. Did you feel guilty? Margaret asked. At the time, no. He was paying well. But after I saw what happened to Mrs. Montgomery, how she almost lost her children because of my lies, he looked at me. I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry. Margaret called forensic accountants who traced Garrett's offshore accounts, showed how he'd been stealing from investors for years, moving money through shell corporations, hiding assets. The fraud was sophisticated and extensive. She called Garrett's former business partners who testified about his pattern of manipulation and deceit. Men who'd once called him friend now testified against him, angry they'd been fooled for so long. But the most damning evidence was the recording. My voice and Garrett's, crystal clear, as he confessed to everything. Margaret played it for the jury. The courtroom went silent as Garrett's recorded voice filled the space. You really thought you could beat me, Claire? I've destroyed all our women before you. You were just the smartest, which made breaking you the most fun. The prenup, the custody case, the FBI trap. I planned it all, years in advance. His laugh on the recording was cold and cruel. Sarah, Catherine, Elizabeth, Rachel, you. Each one thought she was special. Each one thought I loved her. Each one signed the prenup without reading it. Each one trusted me completely. Elizabeth was the most fun. She actually killed herself. Saved me the divorce attorney fees. Several jury members gasped. One covered her mouth in horror. The recording continued. Garrett admitting to embezzlement, to fraud, to destroying women for sport. His own words, condemning him more thoroughly than any prosecutor could. When the recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Garrett's lawyer looked horrified. Margaret turned to the jury. You just heard the defendant, in his own words, admit to decades of premeditated abuse, admit to driving a woman to suicide and laughing about it, admit to fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The defense will try to claim entrapment. They'll say Mrs. Montgomery set him up, but entrapment requires law enforcement to induce someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. Mrs. Montgomery wasn't law enforcement. She was a victim, trying to protect herself and her children. She paused, looking each jury member in the eye. And more importantly, you cannot entrap someone into confessing to crimes they have already committed. Garrett Montgomery destroyed 4 women before Claire. He was going to destroy her too. And then he was going to find victim number 6. The only question is, are you going to let him? The defense's case was weak and everyone knew it. Thomas Fletcher tried his best. He argued that Garrett was a successful businessman who'd had some failed marriages, that the recording was taken out of context, that divorce is painful but not criminal. But he couldn't explain the pattern. He couldn't explain the fake psychiatric evaluations. He couldn't explain the embezzlement. He couldn't explain Garrett's own words on that recording. Elizabeth was the most fun. She actually killed herself. Those words haunted the courtroom. Then it was time for victim testimony. Margaret called each of us to the stand. Sarah first, describing how Garrett had convinced her to give up her career, then discarded her after exactly 10 years, Catherine, explaining how she'd gone from Harvard-educated lawyer to paralegal making poverty wages because Garrett had destroyed her reputation and her confidence. Rachel, barely able to speak through tears, describing the cousin she'd trusted, the man who'd married her and then calculated her destruction down to the day. Elizabeth's sister, holding up that photo, demanding the jury see the woman her sister had been before Garrett. Happy, alive. He killed her, she said flatly. Maybe he didn't tie the rope himself, but he killed her as surely as if he had. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand in a Navy suit Victoria had bought me. Professional, composed. Nothing like the broken woman who'd stood on that fire escape 6 months ago. Margaret approached me gently. Mrs. Montgomery, can you describe your marriage to Garrett Montgomery? I took a breath and told my story. The whirlwind courtship, the pressure to quit my job, the slow isolation from friends and colleagues, the way he'd controlled every aspect of our lives, always framed as love and protection. I thought I was building a partnership, I said. I thought we were a team, but I was just another mark, another successful woman he wanted to break. How did you feel when he threw you out on Christmas Eve? Destroyed, humiliated, like 15 years of my life, of love, of sacrifice, meant absolutely nothing to him. Like I was disposable, like our daughter was disposable. Did you know at the time about the previous wives? No, at the time, I thought I was the only one. I thought it was my fault somehow, that I'd failed as a wife, as a mother, mom. It took Rebecca showing me those photos to realize I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the problem. He was. Margaret walked me through the rest. The shelter, the premature labor, losing custody of Madison, the FBI trap, giving birth in prison, having Owen taken from my arms. By the time I finished, half the jury was crying. Garrett's lawyer tried to cross-examine, suggesting I was vindictive, that I'd manipulated the situation, that I'd trapped Garrett into confessing. Mrs. Montgomery, isn't it true you went to that party specifically to record Mr. Montgomery? Yes. So you were setting him up. I was giving him an opportunity to tell the truth. He didn't have to confess. He chose to, because he thought he'd won, because he wanted me to know exactly how thoroughly he'd destroyed me. That's not entrapment. That's justice. The lawyer had no response to that. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours that felt like 4 years. Madison held my hand in the hallway. Victoria paced. The other wives waited together. A sisterhood born of shared trauma. When the jury returned, the forewoman was a black woman in her 50s who'd looked increasingly angry throughout the trial. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of embezzlement, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to, guilty, 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 guilty. 23 counts, guilty on every single one. Garrett's face finally showed emotion. Shock, disbelief. He'd truly believed he'd get away with it. Even with all the evidence, all the testimony, he'd believed his wealth and power would save him. They didn't. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. Judge Richard Blackwell, a stern man in his 60s, presided. "Mr. Montgomery," the judge said, looking at Garrett with undisguised contempt. "In 30 years on the bench, I have never seen anything quite like this. You are a predator who weaponized the institution of marriage itself. You systematically destroyed 5 women's lives for no reason other than your own entertainment and sense of power." He paused, consulting his notes. "One of your victims is dead. The others will carry the scars of what you did for the rest of their lives. You stole from investors who trusted you. You corrupted the legal system. You showed no remorse. Even now, I see no understanding in your eyes of the magnitude of what you've done. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. You will also pay $150 million in restitution to your victims and the investors you defrauded. You will have no contact with any of your former wives or their children. Ever. 25 years. Garrett would be 67 when he got out. If he lived that long. Federal prison isn't kind to wealthy white-collar criminals. As they led him away in chains, Garrett looked at me one final time. I stared back, chin high, Madison beside me, surrounded by the women he'd tried to destroy. We'd won, UAN, not just legally. We'd won our lives back, our dignity back, our future back. And Garrett Montgomery, the man who'd thought himself untouchable, was going to spend the next 25 years learning exactly how wrong he'd been. 6 months after Garrett's sentencing, I stood in the penthouse looking out at Lake Michigan. Owen, 8 months old now, played with blocks on the floor. Madison practiced piano, her music filling the rooms. The settlement had come through. $150 million, split between me and the 4 other wives. Victoria had voluntarily given up her claim to Garrett's assets. Blood money, she'd called it. I'd used my share to start a foundation. The Claire Montgomery Legal Defense Fund. We provided free legal representation to women escaping abusive marriages. We'd helped 87 women so far. Each one got an experienced attorney, financial support, and safe housing. The 4 other wives were rebuilding too. Sarah had opened a bakery. Catherine had returned to practicing law. Rachel was writing a book. We'd become friends, bonded by trauma and survival. Madison was thriving. Therapy had helped. She'd gained the weight back, started smiling again. She'd been accepted to a prestigious music academy for high school. Her trauma had made her more empathetic, more aware of suffering in others. "Mom," she said, finishing her piece, "can I ask you something always? Do you hate Dad?" I thought about it carefully. "No, I feel sorry for him. He threw away a family, a daughter who loved him, a son he'll never know. He destroyed 5 women's lives and his own. For what power control? Those are hollow things. They don't keep you warm at night. Do you think he regrets it?" "I don't know. Narcissists rarely regret. They just feel sorry for themselves. I feel like I should miss him, but I don't. Is that wrong?" "No, baby. He hurt you. It's okay not to miss people who hurt you." Owen started crying. I picked him up, held him close. He looked so much like Garrett. Same dark hair, same bone structure, but his eyes were different. Gentler, kinder. "You're nothing like your father," I whispered to him. "You're going to be better." The doorbell rang. Blake Hartford, dropping off some legal documents. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Good. It's strange being back here. But it's ours now. Really ours. You know, Claire, I have to say I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've never seen someone fight back the way you did. Most women in your situation would have given up. I had no choice. When you have children depending on you, you find strength you didn't know you had. He handed me the papers. These are the final settlement documents. Garrett's appeals were denied. This is over. You're free. Free. What a concept. After Blake left, I sat down with my laptop. Rebecca had convinced me to write a book about my experience. I'd been hesitant at first. Who wanted to read about my humiliation? But then I'd started getting letters. Hundreds of them. From women who'd watched the trial, read Rebecca's articles, heard my testimony. Women who were living through their own versions of my nightmare. Women who needed to know they could survive. So I was writing, not just my story, but all our stories. Mine, Sarah's, Catherine's, Elizabeth's, Rachel's. A testament to survival. A roadmap for women trapped in similar situations. The book would be called The Fifth Wife. Rebecca was helping me edit. We had a publisher interested. All proceeds would go to the foundation. That evening, Victoria came for dinner. She'd become a fixture in our lives. A grandmother to Madison and Owen, though the title came with guilt and regret. "How are you both?" she asked, hugging Madison, cooing at Owen. "Good," Madison said. "Mom's book is almost done." Victoria looked at me. "I'm proud of you, Claire, for fighting, for surviving, for not letting him break you." "He did break me," I said honestly. "But I put myself back together, stronger this time. That's all any of us can do." We ate dinner together, normal, domestic, peaceful. The life I thought I had before turned out to be a lie. But this was real. After Victoria left and Madison went to bed, I stood in Owen's nursery watching him sleep. This time 2 years ago, I'd been planning a Christmas party, believing I had a perfect marriage, trusting completely. Now I knew better. Trust had to be earned. Love had to be proven through actions, not words. And strength wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built, piece by piece, from the wreckage of your worst moments. My phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. "Article just dropped. Garrett got beaten up in prison. He's in medical. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at that text, waited to feel satisfaction, vindication, but I felt nothing. Garrett was just a man now. Not a monster, not a threat, just a man serving time for his crimes. I deleted the text and went to bed. 2 years after the worst night of my life, I stood in the same penthouse preparing for Christmas Eve. But everything was different this time. Madison helped me decorate, laughing as Owen tried to eat ornaments. The tree was real, smelling like pine and winter. Presents underneath, wrapped in silver and gold. The guests tonight weren't Garrett's business partners or social climbers. They were real people. The 4 other wives. Rebecca, Blake, Victoria, Helen Winters from the shelter, Carol from the diner, Anna Campbell, the social worker. Every person who'd helped us when we had nothing. The doorbell started ringing at 7. Soon the penthouse filled with warmth and conversation and laughter. Real laughter. Not the performative kind from Garrett's parties. Sarah brought her famous chocolate cake. Catherine brought her new girlfriend, a doctor she'd met at one of our foundation events. Rachel brought copies of her book, freshly published. Madison played piano, but this time she played music she loved. Contemporary pieces. Music with soul. Owen clapped along, off rhythm, but enthusiastic. At 8 o'clock, I stood in the center of the room and raised my glass. 2 years ago tonight, I thought my life was ending. A man I'd trusted for 15 years threw me and my daughter out like garbage. We had nothing. One suitcase between us, nowhere to go, and snow falling outside. The room was silent, listening. I stood in a diner at midnight, pregnant and homeless, and thought I'd never be okay again. I thought he'd destroyed me completely. But you know what? He didn't destroy me. He freed me. Several women were crying now. He freed me from a marriage built on lies. He freed me from believing my worth was tied to his approval. He freed me to discover who I really was underneath the role of perfect wife. I looked at Madison. He thought throwing us out meant he won, but all he did was show us what we were capable of. My daughter is stronger, braver, more empathetic because of what we survived. My son will grow up knowing that strength isn't about power over others. It's about resilience in the face of cruelty. I raised my glass higher. So here's to everyone in this room. To Helen, who gave us shelter. To Carol, who gave us $40 when she had nothing. To Rebecca, who exposed the truth. To Blake, who fought for us. To Victoria, who chose justice over blood. To Sarah, Catherine, and Rachel, who survived the same nightmare and came out stronger. And here's to every woman watching or listening who's where I was 2 years ago, who thinks she'll never escape, who thinks her abuser has won. I promise you he hasn't. You will survive this. You will thrive. You will build something beautiful from the ashes he left behind. The room erupted in applause. Women hugged. Tears flowed freely. Victoria approached me, eyes wet. That was beautiful. Claire, it was true. Garrett wrote me a letter last week. From prison. He says he's changed, that he's remorseful. He wants to see Madison and Owen. What did you tell him? I told him no, that he gave up the right to be their grandfather when he destroyed their mother, that 25 years isn't enough punishment for what he did. Thank you. She touched my arm. I should have protected you. I should have protected all of you. I'm sorry. You're here now. That's what matters. Later, after most guests had left, I stood on the balcony looking at the city lights. Madison joined me, Owen asleep on my shoulder. Do you ever think about him, she asked. Sometimes, usually when I'm tired or stressed, old habits. Do you miss him? I miss who I thought he was. The man I married. But that man never existed. He was a performance. A lie. Madison leaned against me. I'm glad it happened. I looked at her, surprised. I know that sounds terrible, Ma, she continued. But if Dad hadn't done what he did, I wouldn't know how strong you are, how strong I am. I wouldn't understand that love isn't about control or power. I wouldn't have met all these amazing women. I wouldn't be who I am now. You're very wise for 16. I had a good teacher. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. It was beautiful now, not threatening, just snow on Christmas Eve. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. Claire, it's Garrett. I know you blocked me. I'm using a friend's phone. I just want to say I'm sorry for everything. I was sick. I am sick, but I'm getting help. Therapy, medication. I know I can never fix what I broke, but I want you to know I regret it every day. I threw away my family. I destroyed you. I deserve everything that's happened to me. I just hope one day you can forgive me, not for my sake, for yours, because carrying hate is exhausting, and you deserve peace. I'm sorry, and I'm so sorry. I read it twice, then deleted it. Madison had seen the screen. Was that Dad? Yes. What did he say? That he's sorry. Do you believe him? I thought about it. About the man who'd confessed on tape to destroying 5 women. About the narcissist who'd planned my destruction for years. About the father who'd let his daughter be dragged from a courtroom screaming. No, I said. I don't believe him. Narcissists apologize when they want something. When they think remorse will manipulate you. Real remorse is quiet. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. So you're not going to forgive him. Maybe someday, but not because he asked, because I decided to let go. There's a difference. Owen stirred, making sleepy baby sounds. I kissed his forehead. Come on, I said. Let's get this little guy to bed. We went inside. The penthouse was quiet now. Warm. Safe. Ours. I put Owen in his crib, tucked Madison into bed, and sat in the living room alone with a cup of tea. The Christmas tree lights twinkled. Outside, snow continued to fall. 2 years ago, I'd walked these same streets in that snow, homeless and pregnant, my daughter crying beside me. I'd thought my life was over. I'd thought Garrett had won. But sitting in the penthouse now, surrounded by the evidence of our survival, Madison's piano music, Owen's toys, photos of real friends, I realized something. Garrett hadn't won. Not even close. He'd taken things from me. My home, my money, my sense of safety. But he hadn't taken what mattered. He hadn't taken my strength. He hadn't taken my love for my children. He hadn't taken my ability to rebuild. If anything, he'd given me gifts he never intended. He'd shown me what I was capable of. He'd forced me to become stronger, smarter, more resilient. He'd inadvertently led me to an army of women who understood, who fought beside me, who became real family. The revenge I'd gotten wasn't elaborate or planned. It was simple. I survived. I thrived. I turned my pain into purpose. I helped other women escape what I'd escaped. Garrett was in prison, alone, hated, broken. I was here in a home filled with love, surrounded by people who genuinely cared. That was revenge enough. I finished my tea and turned off the lights. Tomorrow was Christmas. Madison wanted to make pancakes. Owen would open presents, probably playing with the wrapping paper instead of the toys. Victoria was coming for lunch. Normal, domestic, peaceful. The life I'd always wanted. Real this time. As I climbed into bed, I thought about all the women out there going through what I'd gone through. Women in shelters tonight, wondering if they'd survive. Women in court battles, terrified they'd lose their children. Women facing abusers who seemed untouchable. I wanted them to know you will survive this. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But you will come through it stronger than you were before. Because that's what women do. We endure, we adapt, we survive. And when men try to break us, we break their plans instead. Garrett thought throwing me out on Christmas Eve was my ending. He thought humiliating me in front of 100 people would destroy me forever. But he was wrong. It was just the beginning of me becoming who I was always meant to be. Strong, independent, whole. Not his wife, not anyone's victim. Just Claire, mother, survivor, fighter. And that was more than enough.